Hello ladies and gentlemen, today in War Thunder we're having a look at the SU-76M. It's a Tier 2 tank destroyer with a BR of 2.3, so basically in arcade you're going to be looking to come up against stuff like the T-80, the early T-34s, obviously the T-50 as well, and the T-28. Looking at the German side, you will be obviously coming up against stuff like, let's see, the Panzer III Aus L at the very range of its BR, but mainly the Aus F, the Aus E, and the Aus C, so the early German Panzer IIIs and IVs, also Panzer IIs, and the Stug 3. Now, I would say the SU-76's main competitor is obviously the Stug 3. They have the same battle rating, they're both tank destroyers, so I'm going to be making a lot of comparisons between them in this video. It is armed with a 76mm ZIS-3 cannon, which is obviously on the front, mounted slightly to the left, basically because they wanted more armour on the gun mantlet, which is quite interesting. But armour-wise, as we get into it, your max armour is 25mm, which is this bit around the gun. You also have 15 and 15 and 10 and 15, so this is all basically 15mm, 10 at the side, nothing at the back, and 15 here as well. So basically, well, you don't have a lot of protection, let's just say that. Looking at the modifications, actually I believe any tank can penetrate this, except for maybe the, let's see, just want to check, the T-60. Yeah, the T-60 might struggle to penetrate you at long ranges, but that's about it. Everything else can absolutely wreck you. Now, looking at the modifications, I would say the main one in all of these is the fire extinguisher, because the engines are mounted here and here. So basically, any shot from the side or the front, it will probably set you on fire, especially with high explosive ammo. Looking at the ammo you actually get, you do get some heat ammo if you want to use it, obviously high explosive and shrapnel shells as well. You also get some APCR and APBC as well. But the problem is, to me, there is no real reason to use any of these, because this still has a lot of penetration even at 1,000 meters. It has enough penetration to penetrate anything you're going to come up against, even the Panzer III Aus L and the Aus F. You have 67mm of penetration at 1,000 meters, and this thing has, well, 57mm of armor at the front, obviously the spaced armor, but the F2, 50mm with no spaced armor, so you can easily penetrate that. So, and it's high explosive as well. So, I would probably stick with the first ammunition you get. Other things of note, the engine is always useful, because, well, this thing does not have a powerful engine to begin with, 140 horsepower. The only things in the Russian tech tree which have less than that are the ZIS-30, the T-60 and the T-26. Everything else, well, they basically dwarf this, which is kind of sad. Customization wise, unfortunately, you do not get another camouflage except for this one, so I made my own, which is basically just a winter camouflage. I don't think it would have been very hard for Gaijin to make something like this, but, you know, might be in a later patch. Also, may I just say, this model is beautiful. The fact that there's a shovel and an axe and a hammer and even like the ammo shells on this side and all of the shell compartments and everything, it is wonderful. I love this model, and most of the models in the game are absolutely wonderful. Very, very good depictions of what the tank or tank destroyer was like in real life. Also, the vertical guidance of the gun is unfortunately an issue, -3 degrees down, which I'm kind of struggling to see if that's actually true or not. And, well, 25 degrees up, so if you want to shoot planes, you can shoot planes. Max speed of 40 kilometers an hour. It's not a fast vehicle, but, you know, it can still bomb around. It accelerates very, very quickly. But anyway, let's get on to some arcade battles. And so today I have 2 arcade battles to show you to start things off. Basically, the first one is me using the SU-76 in an offensive and aggressive mode. and the other one is a defensive mode. Now, unfortunately in arcade battles, I feel like tank destroyers like this, or self-propelled guns if you want to call it that, are at a disadvantage. The SU-76 in real life was very good, very, very good at sneak attacks and basically holding off positions and being camouflaged by its surroundings and getting the first shot off. Now, in arcade, because of how the spotting system works, that's not really going to happen that much. I mean, if you get the first shot off, great. Well done. You've done really well, just like I did there with that Stug 3. Got a good hit in him, and now I can cap the base. But he knows where I am. That's a real problem. And because of the Stug 3's frontal armor, I can't really trade shots with it. I'm trying to, I'm hitting him, but unfortunately I'm not doing a lot of damage. The good thing is he's not doing a lot of damage to me. But there are other things that can hit me, such as the AI. And even the AI in this thing can damage you. Now, this self-propelled gun, or tank destroyer, or assault gun, doesn't matter what you want to call it, it has some very big disadvantages. Obviously with the open top, it's not... Your crew gets knocked out very, very easily. It's as simple as that, no matter where the enemy hits. I've had people plant shots into my lower glacis and upper glacis and take out my gunner. That's just how it works in this thing. So, you always have to keep yourself facing the enemy. Now, if you're getting attacked from multiple points, that's impossible to do. There'll always be somebody who'll be able to get a shot into your side. And one of the major drawbacks I have of this thing is its gun depression. Supposedly, it's -3 degrees. Well, yes, it's -3 degrees from where your gun is right now, but when you look at the gun, it's mounted above the T-70 chassis, which is on, and I run into a tree. I was checking where the enemy was coming from, because after killing that Stug 3, I know he's going to come back for revenge, and here he comes. But I ran into a tree, and unfortunately, I did a lot of damage to myself, because hey-ho, good old trees in this game, but I am able to turn around, which is always nice. But here, in other tank destroyers and other vehicles, I would be able to shoot this guy and still be in a very advantageous position. But instead, I have to go forward, and I basically have to take a shot from him, and then I can attack him. The gun depression is terrible in this thing. I wouldn't say it's -3, I'd say it's about 0. Because of that chassis, you can't aim down at all. And also, with on the gun, there is that like sleeve on it, which also prevents you from pulling this thing down as well. Now, I get a good hit into that Stug 3, and I decide to move up, because he's not going to come over that hill if he knows what's good for him, so I have to go on the offensive. The problem is, I don't really have the armor for this, and this is where your armor lets you down. If I had just sat here, then he could have just kept rocking over that ridge and shooting me and then moving back, or I could just go forward and attack him. And he plants a shot into my frontal glacis, or my upper glacis, and sets me on fire, basically immobilizing me, and I don't have the gun depression to hit him. Because, yeah. Also, another thing is like the driver's hatch also prevents your gun from shooting down, so... it's really annoying in this thing, because the way I like to play tank destroyers is kind of sit back behind your allies and try and get some shots off. Try and do stuff like that, but the problem with it is you can't do that in this thing, because you have to basically angle yourself on a hill so you don't have to worry about gun depression. Your elevation is wonderful, you could shoot down planes in this thing, but you can't really attack tanks who are below you, so getting above them in advantageous positions is not a great idea in this thing, as you'll see in a sec. Now, on this map, I always like to go to the south, because I feel like whoever controls the south of this map will win the map, because they have good covering fire over the centre, and even the other side of the map. They can basically pin the enemy down, while your guys move forward in the centre. But as you can see, I can't point my gun down here, and if I go over the edge, I definitely will take shots. And because I'll be over the edge, that means that where all my crew are, they'll be exposed, and it'll be easy to hit them. So I can't do anything like that. Now, once again, I can't point my gun down at this thing, so I have to roll around the side and try and get some hits in. But using this thing aggressively is not a great idea. All he has to do is plant one shot into me, and by the way, they need to sort out this plane, because at the moment I'm actually stuck below this plane. I can't move. The hitbox on it is wrong. Now this is a time where this gun can absolutely troll you. Basically, what happens with this thing is sometimes it can absolutely capitulate tanks. It can absolutely destroy them. I'm using the normal ammo, by the way, at the moment. I usually carry a bit of heat and a bit of the APCR stuff you get. But basically I like using the normal ammo because it's got a decent amount of armor penetration. Basically, it'll be able to penetrate anything you can hit in this thing around this tier and BR. Maybe not KV1 and stuff, but you hardly ever see them in this, which is always nice. But the problem is that every so often you'll get into situations where you'll get in a head-on like that, and as you can see, I was hitting him, I was penetrating him, but I wasn't doing anything to him, and it wasn't about where I was shooting him. I was shooting him exactly where his crew would have been. So, yeah. And once again, cannot point the gun down. At this point I'm getting frustrated because I can't use this place as advantageously as possible. Now, once again, this BT-7 can outturn me. He can get into my side, and my tank actually burns down, so he sets me on fire, which is never good. I hardly ever die from getting my crew knocked out in this thing. It's always basically just set on fire. Unfortunately, where your engine is located, in the front, it's very easy to hit and very easy to set on fire. There isn't enough armor to stop people from planting shot after shot into you and not be able to take damage. But this is the second game where I play a lot more defensively. I try and use the tank to what I believe its strengths are. Basically, getting into positions like this where the enemy can't really see you, and being able to basically plant shots after shot into them. Now this to me works better. It works better than playing this offensively. I mean, it is a tank destroyer after all. The good thing about this is at long ranges, you still hold really, really good penetration. So you don't have to fire heat to penetrate stuff at long range, which means that you have that extra muzzle velocity, which means that it's easier to guide your shots and lead them. If I was trying to shoot this guy with heat, it would be really, really tough. Another thing you've got to take into account is that this gun doesn't really fire straight. Sometimes your shots will go right, sometimes they'll go left. It's very, very annoying, but that's just the nature of this gun. Maybe I need more crew points in accuracy. But as you can see, even in this position, I can still get shot. But because I'm further away from the enemy as I was before, the shots don't do as much damage, which is always nice. I get a good shot into this guy, and as you can see, I knock out components, but what I want to see from this gun, it is a good gun at this BR. I wish it did more damage, like with the, I believe it's the ZIS, the first self-propelled gun you get. That thing, just with its ammo, absolutely tears through anything around its BR, and it's able to penetrate and do a ton of damage. I believe it's got over 100mm of penetration with its armor. This thing doesn't. But yeah, if this gun was able to easily one-shot people or knock out stuff easily, then I would use it more. Now, as you can see, it can from those last two shots, as long as you aim them properly. But I had to expose myself to get into a position where I was able to easily and accurately shoot those guys. Now, you could argue that maybe you should stay behind your allies and basically wait for the enemy to aim their guns at you, and aim their guns at your allies and then take shots after they're fired. Yes, you can do that, but the problem with that is, well, I did it there and my ally got absolutely creamed. If I was in this position before, then we should have been, in a better position. Now, this position on this map in the jungle is actually really good because you have in front of you like rocks which cover you, and also you have basically a good line of fire onto that part where one of the points is. Obviously on this map at the moment there's only one objective, but a lot of people like to use that to get spotting over the point. So that's a nice spot to have. In the SU-85, another thing to take into account is when you've killed somebody, it's always a good idea to move. It's always a good idea, if the enemy knows where you are, they are going to hunt you, so it's nice to basically get a hit in and move. This thing it's okay with mobility. I mean, it's not great, its traverse is pretty terrible, but in a straight line it can do some speed. Which means that you can sometimes, outmaneuver people and stuff like that. I mean, its main competitor at this BR is the Stug-3, or the first assault gun you get with the Germans. And I believe the German tank has a better traverse, so you can't really outmaneuver it or anything like that. But as you can see, another thing, I've basically taken 2 major shots here, and they've both planted straight into my upper glacis, which basically means you cannot rely on this thing's armour. The things that have penetrated me have done a decent amount of damage, but not a ton, but they have severely hurt my crew, which is one of the problems. If you get hit in this thing, usually you'll get a loader injured or a gunner injured or something, and then your gun becomes less effective. The fire rate on this thing is one of the slowest guns at this BR. I think only the T-34 1940 has a slower reload. This thing has a reload of over 7 seconds. So that actually gives you time, looking at it in a positive way, that gives you time to shoot, relocate and shoot again. Looking at it negatively, whatever is shooting at you will be able to get more shots into you than you can get into them. So that's one thing to take into account. But I'm just annoyed at this thing because of its armour. I mean, its armour isn't great, and a lot of people are firing heat and APCR and stuff like that, so they are going to penetrate you. But with that sloping, I thought it would be better. But as you can see, people have just planted shot after shot into my upper glacis, and don't even get me started on if they hit your gun mantler. Your gun gets knocked out very easily, and your crew suffers as a consequence. And as you can see, there is a guy who has decided to rush our base, so I basically make sure I look at the map and see what's going on. That's another thing you've got to look for in this tank. You've got to keep map awareness. You have to, if you're looking at an enemy and engaged with him, you have to look at your sides to see if anybody is going to flank you. As you saw there, as I was shooting at that guy, I looked at my map while I was zeroing in, and then I saw a guy who's coming around the flank. So what do? I have to move. At that point, I do not have the gun depression to shoot this guy. It is as simple as that. If he comes up that ramp, I am screwed. I'm still screwed because I can't get my gun pointed down. I try and get some elevation here so I can shoot down. But the problem is, because I've done that, it has angled my tank down. So whatever shot comes into me from that side it has more chance of penetrating because of the way the shot will come down into my armour. And as you can see, as these guys come round, I can't point the goddamn gun down, and this guy can point his gun at me. Another thing is that your driver gets knocked out in an instant. Your driver really struggles in this thing because, well, he's at the front of the tank, and because you'll always be angled against the enemy at the front, he will probably he'll harbour the hits, basically, as well as your engine. Now, as I said before, this thing easily gets set on fire. It's one of the most annoying things, and if you don't have extinguishers unlocked, that is probably one of the first modifications I would definitely go for, even if you don't have any of the other ones, because this thing's engine is so annoying, and basically you've really got to be on your wits about it when using your extinguishers. Another thing is that this thing does not get artillery support, which is kind of annoying, because when you think about it, if you had artillery support, you could basically try and hit enemies which you weren't able to hit. Like if in that first match, the Stug-3 was in that position, I could have sat where I was, put an artillery barrage on him, and then he would have had to force to come at me or go backwards, but unfortunately that did not happen. But in that game, as you saw, I played much more defensively. And, well, I did better because of it. Defense is a decent offense in this thing as long as your team is doing well. you can't really play defensively if your team isn't doing very well. That just doesn't work really well. But yeah, I did okay, which is the main thing. I could have done a lot better, but that's just how it is. Unfortunately, this vehicle isn't wonderful, but it isn't terrible at the same time. But anyway, let's get on to some performance testing. And so here we are in the performance testing part of this review. First of all, we're going to see how long it takes to get up to 40 kilometers an hour, which is supposedly the max speed of this thing. In real life, with the secondary engines that they added, it actually got up to 45 kilometers an hour. But, you know, that's something for another day. As we can see, it actually has pretty good acceleration. It actually has very good acceleration. It didn't actually take us that long to get up to it. Obviously, 40 kilometers an hour is... it's okay. Like, for a tank destroyer, obviously not for a light tank, but it's good enough for this thing. So it actually moves and is quite mobile when going in a straight line. Turning, on the other hand, takes a bit of a long time to turn, and when you have this really bad, like basically your cone of fire is very limited in this tank, it's not great. But anyway, let's get on to the gun. Obviously this is a 76mm. Even at extreme ranges of 1,000 meters, you have about 67 millimeters of penetration, which is still enough to get through anything that you're coming up against with the normal ammunition. As you can see, straight through at this range. Now, the normal ammunition is APHE, basically. It's armor piercing with some high explosive in it. I would go for that ammo the most. You also get some APCR and a... Hey, look. Can I... Oh, I can just about aim down here. But the second one you get is the this one, which is basically exactly the same thing, slightly better penetration. It is ballistically capped, meaning that it reduces the getting shattered on impact. The problem is it doesn't have that HE capability, so it doesn't really do as much damage. Then you get the APCR, which has insane penetration at short ranges, but to be honest, pretty much useless in my opinion. I really don't rate APCR that much in the grand scheme of things, just because when you actually think about it, your normal ammo that you get at the start is still able to penetrate basically anything you're going to come up against. You're not going to come up against a Panzer V or this Panther over here, so, you know, stuff like that is pretty useless. Then you have the heat ammo, which, if you can aim, it's actually really, really good. You just have to adjust your aim, because if you think about it, it only has 400 meters per second of basically the muzzle velocity, whereas this, I believe it has over 600, which is still less than the Panzer III that I reviewed before, but, you know, it's still okay. As you can see, we can actually penetrate this Panther in the side of the turret, which is absolutely wonderful, even with the normal ammo. So that shows the penetration of this thing. The penetration is absolutely wonderful with regards to the gun. The amount of damage it can do varies quite a lot, in my opinion. I would still stick with the normal ammo just because of that high explosive stuff, but sometimes it feels like kind of a donkey gun where it'll take out a guy in one hit, and then the next shot it'll just hit it and do nothing. Penetration is never a problem. The problem is knocking out key components. As you can see there, you have to lead your shot a little bit because the muzzle velocity is still pretty low in this tank. The reload time is one of the slowest around this BR. The only one which is slower is the Panzer IV Ausf F2, which is at a BR of 3.0. And I believe one of the early T-34s is also slower, but apart from that, yeah, this has a pretty slow reload time. Armor-wise, your thickest armor you have is 25mm, which I believe is this gun mantlet here, and because the gun mantlet was actually put there to give that some increased armor. Now, bonk. Oh, I hit the track again. Your other armor is basically just 10mm at places, and even worse than that, obviously, at the back and the side. So if you are engaging somebody up close, you obviously want to be pointing forward at a lower altitude than them, basically because you can't really point this gun down. So, in all regards, this thing can be penetrated by the worst guns in the game. The T-60 has an armor penetration of 20, I think, with its worst ammo, so that can penetrate you. The Panzer II-C, the reserve that you get for the Germans with the 20mm, can penetrate you, and so can the T-26. So basically all of them can penetrate you, plus everything else in the game. So yeah, just keep that into account. This gun is good, it has really good penetration, but your armor is terrible. So sniping is definitely a possibility when you're using this thing. Maneuverability is not very good though, which worries me greatly. But still, the fact that you get all these ammo choices is nice. Armor piercing, and heat. You also get some high explosive to take out AA and stuff like that, and also shrapnel shot if you feel like going after some... Let's see if we can hit this guy. Oh, donked him. You can use some shrapnel shot to shoot down aircraft if you so feel. The vertical on this, basically, you can go up at about a 25-degree angle, as you can see. So shooting down aircraft is an actual possibility in this thing, which is quite interesting. But pointing the gun down, you can't really. Let's just get it down here. So yeah, as you can see, you have -3 of basically depression on the gun, which isn't great. And to be honest, you always want to attack an enemy when looking down on them, basically, so you can do this and angle your gun up. Obviously, with your armor being so weak, it doesn't really matter how you angle it, because whatever hits you is going to go through anyway, unless you're really, really lucky and can bounce a shot. Obviously, with the angling of the armor, if somebody shoots you from, over here or something, you can bounce shots, but it's very, very unlikely. Another thing to take into account is the fact that the engines, you have 2 engines, one on either side for each track, are mounted on the left and the right side of the front of the tank, and they set on fire very easily when shot from the side, or even from an angle of about here or here. So extinguishers is a must in this thing, one of the first modifications you definitely should get. The ammo isn't that necessary, so, going for that last doesn't really matter. But yeah, it struggles in a lot of ways due to its armor and due to stuff like that, but its gun is pretty good when it decides to work properly. So anyway, let's get on to some historical fact-finding. So after doing some historical fact-finding on the SU-76M, to be honest, I haven't really found that much, but I have found some interesting things that might enlighten you about why the tank came about and what it basically is made of. In 1941, when Germany invaded the Soviet Union, Stalin basically realized with his commanders that the Russians didn't really have something that could easily take out the Panzer Corps, the Panzer IIIs and the Panzer IVs, which were attacking the Russians. So basically, they had to devise a plan of making something that could be able to take out something like a Panzer III or a Panzer IV, the early models. So, what they did is, they took a T-70 light tank chassis, which is actually in the game, the T-70, and they basically just put an artillery gun on it. The 76.2mm 3-inch field gun on the top of the chassis. And this was basically designed because it had been tried and tested, this 76mm gun. It was able to easily take out the Panzer forces. So basically that was the main reason why this thing was made, to combat the German advance, as are a lot of tanks. They are basically designed to combat the enemy tanks. But with the added weight that the gun had compared to the T-70's, its turret, They had to add an extra road wheel, which isn't, that big of a difference on the track. And also, they had to replace the engines. The engines were just not powerful enough to move this thing around, so they changed the engines, which, it helped out the tank a lot with maneuverability, but still not great. The maximum armor thickness of the first SU-76 was only 25mm, which gave it the nickname from the Russian troops, the Suchka, I believe it is. And basically, this means the little bitch, because of the armor plating on the rear of the vehicle. So basically, it could be taken up the arse quite easily. So some nice little sense of humour from the Russians there. And basically, the variant we see in game, the SU-76M, was the one which was mainly produced. A weird, interesting fact is that the SU-76 was actually the most produced vehicle by the Russians, apart from the T-34. So this thing, the Russians had a lot of hope in this thing. And to be honest, they weren't wrong. It was able to take out Panzer IIIs and Panzer IVs. The armour on the Panzers was just not good enough. And it could even, with a side shot, take out a Panther when needed. The only problem with it is that it didn't have a lot of armour. It kind of struggled in a lot of ways, and compared to the T-34 and stuff like that, it wasn't that great. But anyway, originally it was obviously designed as an anti-tank weapon, but it lost the edge to the ZIS-3 L-41 main gun, as the German tanks, their armour increased. So when you look at the Ausf F2 and the Panzer III Ausf L, they have extra armour. And, the SU-76 became not really being able to penetrate that, unfortunately. So then the decision was made to make it into direct fire support for Soviet troops. So basically, it would be part of the army. It would be, accompanies with an army squad or an army brigade or a soldier brigade, whatever you want to call it, and it basically gave close support. So it became interesting with that. Then with the SU-76M, that was when the open top came about. And even though it had a lack of crew protection, it actually had some advantages. It easily allowed better on-field communications with the men around it, which is always good. And also, it reduced the combat weight. So it meant that the SU-76M had an increased top speed, which is always useful. So basically, these variants, including the M, were very good against light and medium class tanks of the Germans. And even though it could take out a Panther, it still wasn't, they were basically looking for a better gun and a better vehicle after this. So at the end of the war, even in 1942, these things were actually kind of used as artillery tractors, which is quite interesting. There was also another variant, the SU-76B, which had an enclosed crew compartment, and the ZSU-37 self-propelled anti-aircraft gun. So basically they changed it into an AA gun. It was also used in the Korean War, which is quite interesting. But overall, there's not that much about this thing, which is truly enlightening. There was, 13,932 SU-76Ms made, and about 360 SU-76, which were the first type. Obviously, the engines they had two of them, one for each track. The GAZ-203 engine, it had 170 horsepower, and its power-to-weight ratio of 17 horsepower per ton is not great, and, well, its operational range of 320k is okay, but its top speed of 45 kilometers an hour wasn't great. The SU-76 actually was very useful in marshland, where it was used to great effect, because people thought that tanks weren't to be able to go across swamps and marshes and such, but the SU-76 was able to, so it was able to give the Russians the edge in that kind of combat, which is always nice to see. So yeah, the fact that it was called the Bitch, or the Little Bitch, is quite interesting. It was also named the Golosvili Ferdinand, or the bare-arsed Ferdinand. Obviously the Russian troops did not like the fact that you could get penned behind very, very easily. But anyway, let's get on to some realistic battles. So here we are in the realistic battles section, where today I have two battles for you, because to be honest, the first one I recorded, which was this one, I believe it shows the weaknesses this SU-76 has, whereas the other one shows how it can be played as long as you're given the right circumstances in a great way. Now, on this map, basically it's very close quarters, and the SU-76 obviously thrives at long range, because it still has really good penetration, even at 2,000 meters. The problem is, you will never engage somebody at 2,000 meters, or even 1,000 meters, so it comes down to close combat stuff, and in the SU-76, you don't really have a very powerful engine. It sounds like one of those like half bike, half motorcycle engines. It has two of them, by the way, one to power each track. But the thing is, this thing is designed as a long-range tank destroyer, or like basically a support unit for the army, for the soldiers. And you can't use that in realistic battles, or in any mode. Maybe on Kursk you can, but we're not on Kursk, because it's not the only map in the game. So with that really powerful, slow engine, with that really awful and slow engines, there's not much I can do. But I did spot a Panzer IV F2 across the way, so what I can do is try and use this thing to its strengths. I can basically set up in a place where I know he's going to come from, and I can at least get the first shot off, which is so key in this TD. So I can set up in a position where I know he's going to come, because he's going to come for the central point, obviously. I mean, why wouldn't you? It's where the cap is. And I can get into a position where I know that if he comes over that ridge, I'm in a great position. I don't have to worry about the gun depression because I'm aiming upwards. Basically, if I don't kill him, I'm dead. But I've come to grips with that fact. I know that's going to happen or not going to happen. Because there's no way I can engage this guy at long ranges, and I don't have any teammates around me to help me. In realistic, teamwork is actually really, really important, especially on the Russian side. But as we can see, I see him, and good hit into the side, and does absolutely nothing. Points his gun and knocks me out. Now, this is what I mean by this gun is very annoying sometimes. It's very much a troll gun, where I basically hit the side of his tank there, and you could hit in exactly the same place in other times, and what would happen is it would probably knock out some of his crew, or knock out his gunner, or even his horizontal turret movement. So, it's very annoying. And by the time that happened in this map, I realised that basically, as Russians, we're getting a bit owned here. And I don't really know why. And then I realised they're basically camping our base. Now, in something like a T-34, or even a T-28, I could break out of this. I have the belief in myself, in the T-34 or the T-28, I could break out. I could kill that Stug 3 and I could move up. In this thing, not so much. I can't go barreling over that ridge because I wouldn't be able to point my gun at the guy. And also, with this gun, sometimes you may kill him, sometimes you may set him on fire, but other times you'll just be, well, as we saw with that F2, do nothing. So, it's very much an RNG gun in that way, the way I feel. Even at short ranges, you have good penetration. I try and use the AP, basically the first one you get, the armor-piercing high explosive rounds, because all the other ammo types are just really annoying to me. They don't seem to work very well, but I'll get into that in, well, I've already got into it with the performance testing. So I line myself up once again. I don't try and engage the enemy frontally. I'm waiting for them to come over that ridge because, well, you have to play defensive in this thing in realistic. You have to support your team. And unfortunately, my team has been absolutely destroyed. So, basically, I'm here trying to get as many shots as I can. I get an okay shot in the Stug 3, it doesn't really do anything. But luckily, he can't shoot me, which is absolutely wonderful. The problem is, the Germans are using teamwork. Isn't that a weird thing? And basically, they know I'm here, because this guy's spotting me. And they're waiting for me to fire so then they can come over that ridge. I know they're doing this, so what I do is I take a hit, and as I said, this armor is okay at some points until Well, as we saw with that F2 who just planted a shot straight into me. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. That's basically the catchphrase for this tank, or this tank destroyer, or self-propelled gun, whatever you want to call it. Sometimes it's great, other times it's one of the worst machines in the game that I've found. So I take one of them out, and I get into a position where, once again, I don't have to worry about my gun depression. And I can just use its elevation as I want. Now, this thing sets on fire like a cooker, and because unfortunately the front isn't very well armoured. Well, the whole tank isn't very well armoured. But anyway, that was a game where we got absolutely stomped. This is another game on Jungle, where I'm going to show you how I think this thing should be played. Now, it's very hard to engage enemies at long ranges in this game. The maps just aren't big enough. So you can't use that to your strength, but what you can do is support your team. You can get into positions where you're behind your team, they take some shots, the enemy takes some shots, and then you can come around and plant that extra shot into the enemy tank, which may make the difference. And in a lot of cases, it really does, because even if you just knock out maybe a commander or a gunner or a loader or even a driver, it can make a massive difference. And you're not really going to have to worry about penetrating stuff in this tank. I mean, this, with its just average ammo, not even including APCR, it can shoot through a KV-1, which around this BR is probably the most heavily armoured tank. But in Realistic, we don't have to worry about them. The great thing in Realistic about playing as the Russians, you don't have to worry about KV-1s, you don't have to worry about IL-2s, you mainly just have to worry about Panzer IV, Aus, F2s, and the odd BF-110 if it gets a bit crazy. Or even Stukas, which, well, they're Stukas, they're not going to do a lot unless you come up against a guy who's very good at using them. So as you can see, I'm surveying the map, and there's a lot of times where in tanks I want to push the game. I want the momentum of the game to be based around me, so I will go forward and I will attack certain points which I see as in the enemy's weakest. Now, there are 3 points on this map you can do this. In the south, there is the bridges, and then there is, you can go basically left of that little hill where the radio antenna is. Or you can go to the north, go across the beach, do some beach fighting. Or you can go through the centre, which is probably the one which I don't really like. Now, I took out 2 just T-26s there, or, well, basically the AI. But as you can see, I took 1 shot there, and it set me on fire. Now that went through the side, the frontal side of the right side of the SU-76. If, basically, I'd say half the shots which penetrate my front set me on fire, which is a real problem with this thing. A real problem. But as you can see, under artillery barrage and everything like that, I can still get out of there. I'm in a position where I can't get shot. I can't shoot anyone, but I can't get shot. And as you can see, I'm moving into a position where I can support my allies. I realise the north, they're trying to push the north, so I have to get over there. Even though my engine is damaged, I can still move a little bit. I can still go, 20 kilometers an hour and get to the position. So basically you want to, in a way, give your team an advantage in little fights. That's what makes this TD worth it. Where if you see a T-50 coming up against a Panzer III or a Panzer IV or something like that, and the T-50 is being on the defensive and really struggling, you can step in while the Panzer is looking at the T-50 to get a shot and sway the battle. If not, you can always shoot AI because, well, they're AI. Now let's talk about Heat in Realistic. Heat is an interesting shell. It fires at 400 kilometers an hour, which is meters per second. It's very slow. So arcing can be a real problem in this tank in Realistic and Simulator, so that's why I generally don't like using it. I like sticking to the ammo that you get at the start, because I know I can reliably penetrate anything from around this BR without having to do that much aiming. Any Panzer I come up against, I don't really have to aim, I just have to shoot. As long as I don't bounce the shot at a weird angle, I should be okay. Now, in this position, if I was in an SU-122, or even a ZIS, or even a Stug 3, I would have stayed in that position because I would have the gun depression to shoot down and be able to cover my allies. But in this thing you don't, and it breaks my bloody heart while using this thing, because it's its biggest weakness. The fact that it has an open top, a lot of people will say is annoying because your crew gets knocked out a lot. But if you're, if you're playing it how I'm playing it here, basically just supporting your team, you shouldn't really get shot that much. And that's not the biggest issue for me. The biggest issue is the fact that I can't really point my gun. Like, I can just about shoot these guys, but they're coming towards me. It's not because I'm in a good position. And also, there's kind of a false sense of security with this thing, because while you're rolling forward, the tank actually tips to the front. So you think you have you can hit the target, but then when you stop, the TD rolls backwards, and then you lose that. So basically, that can really screw you over sometimes when you feel like you have a shot on someone, and then the tank just stops, and it just stops dead. But there's so many weak things about this tank. When you think about its strengths, the strength is obviously it has a very good gun, but the problem with the gun is, as you saw before, and even just then, shooting at enemies can be incredibly frustrating. If you aim for weak spots, you'll hit them and you'll penetrate, but you sometimes won't do any damage. Now, that may be due to the ammo I'm using. I mean, heat may be easier or better, but I don't trust it yet. Heat is a weird ammo type in this game. It doesn't really work properly, in my opinion, obviously. So it is good that you can penetrate anything. You know if you shoot something, it will get hit. You're not going to bounce many shots. You're hardly going to bounce a shot at all. But getting into a position to take that shot is the problem. Now, as you can see, I'm basically just supporting my team here. That is exactly, as I said, what you have to do. You're not going to be the tank which is going to be the brawler. You're not going to be the tank like the T-50 or the T-34 who's going to go in there and make the first strike. You are going to be the support. You are going to be the guy in the back he's never going to take the glory. He'll get a lot of assists. He's not going to destroy a lot of things, but he'll be there to basically knock the balance in your favour in a battle. And that's kind of what tank destroyers are in this game. Until we get larger maps, until we get even city maps may be interesting. These stuff like the SU-76 are not going to be that useful. But later on, when we get more maps, they may be useful, because engaging at long ranges may be a thing. Unfortunately, for me to engage stuff, I have to be, about half a kilometer away, which does not go to the strengths of this gun. This thing actually used to be very useful in city fights, because it could basically corner off a street. They could sit at one end of the street, the soldiers would spot for the SU-76, and then it would basically turn the gun and shoot. Because of its, even though it can't move its turret that much, it basically gets to a point where you don't really need to, because you're only covering one street, right? But as you can see, I'm taking pot shots at planes, because it seems like the Germans are unwilling to come after us, and except for these Stukas, of course. And this thing, you can actually load it with shrapnel, shrapnel shells, and you can effectively take out aircraft. It's obviously not the best use for it, but if there's nothing else to do, I mean, why not? You can also load, HE ammo if you want to take out AA or landing craft or something like that, but obviously, as a tank destroyer, you want to be focusing on taking out tanks. Now, obviously, this thing isn't strictly a tank destroyer, but in a game like this, where it's basically tank on tank at the moment, so there's a few planes around, but, it's basically tank on tank, you have to use it as a tank destroyer. Like, it used to be very good at supporting troops, but there aren't any troops in the game. They kind of used it as fixed artillery near the end of the war. You can't do that in this game, so you're kind of relegated to the roles that you have. It's kind of like with the OS-2U, the Kingfisher in the planes. That was a recon aircraft, but we don't have a recon element in War Thunder, really. We have the spotting system, but the OS-2U is, it doesn't really matter because everything else can spot the same as it. So it's kind of a problem more with the game than the actual vehicle. I mean, this vehicle is still good because of the gun, but it's very annoying when you see these tanks and TDs not really in their natural environment. Like the SU-76 is never really going to be very good in this game because it was used as an infantry support tank or vehicle, and it used to be very good at that. But when you're facing Panzer IVs and Panzer IIIs every day, it's not going to be great. Now, in real life, it used to be very good against Panzer IIIs and Panzer IVs. In game, it's wonderful against Panzer IIIs and Panzer IVs. You can easily penetrate them. Anything, as I said, you can come up against, you will penetrate. But the drawbacks are pretty bad. As I talked about before, the engine sets on fire a lot, but that's not the major drawback for me. For a tank destroyer to be very useful, it has to be able, as I was doing in arcade, to shoot, move, and then shoot again. Basically, confuse the enemies and they don't know where you are. Basically, get into positions where they look and they go, oh, okay, he's there, and then they point their guns that way, then you quickly go somewhere else, and then you can shoot again because they have to turn before moving. The traverse of the vehicle is absolutely terrible. It doesn't turn very well at all unless you're going at some kind of speed, and getting up to that speed can be a bit of a hassle. But if everything goes in your favour, if all the stars align and you get into those positions where you're able to support your team and be able to get that extra shot off to help out your team, then yes, it can be absolutely wonderful. Getting into those positions in the maps that that was close. Getting into these positions with the maps that we currently have just do not really exist. There are no really flat maps except for Kursk. There aren't any city maps, but they are going to be in the future, so maybe this thing will get a new lease of life in those maps. As long as this thing doesn't just, bounce shots like sometimes it does. But even though this game was very non-eventful, I didn't go on a crazy killing streak or I didn't get absolutely owned in the first 5 minutes, I think it definitely shows how you should use this thing. It has to be a support vehicle. You cannot change the momentum of a battle. You basically have to use your map as guidance at all times. If you're in the north and I don't know how that shot missed, by the way, but if you're in the north and you see trouble in the south, you have to go to the south. You have to be around the action, but not straight in the action. I know that sounds really weird, but that's what a support is. That's what a support is really in any game. It is a guy who is there to help and to be there when needed. To give that extra gun, to give that extra health, to give the enemy something else to shoot at instead of your big brawlers who are at the front. But, I did okay in that. I mean, I didn't really kill anything except for AI, but still got a decent amount of credits and RP. But, it's... I would probably say this thing is best in simulator, but a very close second is realistic. This thing is not an arcade vehicle, but it can definitely be very, very good in realistic and very, very good in simulator when given the correct environment and the correct set of events. But anyway, let's get on to some simulator battles. So here we are in simulator battles, basically on the only map that you get, Kursk. Sometimes you get other maps, but the majority of the time you'll be playing on this one. Now, the SU-76 is an interesting beast. Usually when I fly a plane or drive a tank, the way I see it is it's best in either arcade or realistic. Because in arcade, maneuverability and power is key. So when you have a tank which is maneuverable, or if you have a tank which has a really good gun, then it usually dominates arcade. In realistic, it's all about profiling, it's all about how you match up against the enemy, and because of how the spotting works, and it's basically all about positioning. In simulator, it's a bit different because you don't have those markers, and the SU-76 in real life and in-game was most advantageous when it was basically either outflanking the enemy or setting up traps for enemy troops. Like, the SU-76, when you read when it was actually successful in battles and when it was great, it was either used as a support vehicle for infantry, or it was used at corners of streets or overlooking landscapes when they knew the Germans would attack. And when the Germans attacked, the SU-76 was able to get the first shot off. So that's where that comes from. Now, unfortunately, there is a jackass outside my window with a motorbike, and I hope he burns in hell, but anyway, that's a story for another day. Right, so, let's focus on simulator battles for once. Because this thing has terrible gun depression, what's the first thing that I've reiterated so many times for this review? You have to get into a position where you're above your enemy. Below your enemy, or at an incline, so you're able to shoot your enemy. Now, Kursk is an interesting thing, because you do have rolling hills, but they're not very tall hills. So if you get to a top of a hill, and then angle yourself down, you still may be not able to shoot down that hill, or to shoot at enemies which are far away. But there are some steep inclinations, which you can use to your advantage. So that's the thing to take into account when you're on this map, or in simulator anyway. You want to be setting up ambushes. You always want to be the person to fire the first shot. Because your gun has great penetration, because sometimes it does really well, and other times not so much, you need that safety buffer of being able to fire the first shot. You need to spot the enemy first before they spot you. You need to be in a position to shoot at all times. This thing does not shoot well on the move, and it does not shoot well just before you stop. Like, you know, with the T-34, where with its suspension in game, you can basically you don't have to stop to shoot, or when you do stop, you stop dead, even though in real life the suspension was absolutely terrible. But anyway, with this SU-76, if you don't get the first shot off, you are probably dead. It's about as simple as that. Unless the enemy somehow maybe hits the side of your tank, or hits the armor plating around the gun, then you may survive a shot and not take critical damage before you're dead. So because of these rolling hills, because I need the elements of surprise, I have gone around the western side of the map, which a lot of people go against. They say go around the east. But the thing is with the SU-76, remember what I said before in realistic battles. Basically, it is a team game at the end of the day. And if I went over to the east with the rest of my team, what would I accomplish? I would accomplish absolutely nothing except for the enemy to have another target to shoot at. If I go around the west, I can provide covering fire from the east, and I can also spot anybody coming through the center for my guys on the east. So basically, I can use myself as a scout in an absolutely terrible way, but it is still there. But the main advantage is the element of surprise, and also being able to cover everybody in the position I'm going to, which is invaluable in a tank like this. Because the enemy is going to be facing the other way, or hopefully they will be, on the eastern side of the map, basically I'll be able to get side shots, which is wonderful. Now, a Stug 3 spots me, goes gallivanting across the field, and because of this gun's muzzle velocity, I miss a few shots, but I am using the APCR, I believe, or maybe not. And I'm using it now. Basically, APCR, it has a higher muzzle velocity, so it's easier to shoot at long distances. But I think this shows an interesting thing. Okay, so as I said at the start of this review, the SU-76M's biggest competitor is the Stug 3. Actually, its main competitor is basically the German equivalent of the Stug 3. Now, the Stug 3 in Simulator, its gun has a really, really low muzzle velocity, especially with the upgraded ammo it gets. So that means in Simulator that the SU-76 has the edge if you're not a cracked shot in the Stug 3. Also, the Stug 3's armor doesn't even matter because you have this gun, and also you have APCR. As you saw, taking apart that Stug 3 was absolutely easy, and it's not a thing I could have done in arcade or realistic, because they would have spotted me straight away, they would have seen me going around this flank, they would have just turned their guns and shot me. But because I have this element of surprise, because I'm able to get into a position that is advantageous, because they can't spot me right now, then I can do well. Which, in a tank destroyer, is all you're really looking for. I would even maybe say, so far in this game, obviously my opinion may change, but Simulator Battle is the only real place where tank destroyers are, well, viable. Because as you saw in arcade and realistic, to get a shot off, I need to also get shot. There aren't many positions that I can go to in arcade and realistic where I would be able to take a shot at an enemy and they would not be able to shoot me. But in this case, I can get into positions where I can shoot the enemy and they don't know where the shot has gone, meaning that I can always get the first shot off. Now let's talk about the ammunition this thing gets. It has 60 rounds, or it can carry 60 rounds. Usually I go 20-20-20, or something to that effect. I just have to check something here. I may be wrong on the 60 rounds, so I'm just going to boot up War Thunder. But basically, this thing can carry a decent chunk of ammo, which is always nice with a tank destroyer. Sometimes you will shoot some shots which will obviously miss, especially with this low muzzle velocity that we have. And also, it is nice to be able to carry different ammo types for different situations. People in my position right now may prefer to fire heat because it has more penetration at longer ranges. Now, for me, I think the penetration I have on this gun is easily good enough. Now, let's see. Just checking the modifications here. And that's not correct. How about this? Yeah, it can carry 60. So usually I go with a 20-20-20. 20 armor piercing, high explosive, 20 APCR, and 20 heat. But it really depends on how I'm feeling, because usually I'll maybe take 10 heat and 30 APHE. But it really depends on how confident I are with my own aim. But as you can see in Simulator, this thing, it shines. I've been able to take out Stug 3, I've been able to put some more shots into another Stug 3, and basically, because I've taken out those tank destroyers in the centre, my team has been able to roll through. Also, the team has been spotting for me, and because this gun is pretty accurate, well, when it wants to be, I can easily support them. So, in Simulator it just works, this thing. It has good enough speed to be able to get out of a battle if you run into one head first. It reverses very slowly, but you should be in a position where you shouldn't have to reverse anyway. The only real problem with Simulator is if you come up against a crack shot in a tank, and he's able to just plonk one straight into you, because obviously with your awful armor and your open top, if anybody hits you, you're kind of screwed. I mean, I'm even worried about the artillery, well, the AA on this map, because if the AA starts, chucking shots at me, then what can I do? It's just going to tear me apart. This is one of the only tanks where the AA trucks can absolutely demolish it because of its lack of armor. But, hopefully in the future, they have been confirmed that we're going to get city maps, and we're going to get urban maps, basically. and with destructible terrain and stuff, so that should be interesting. But basically, what I'm hoping for in the future is that this tank destroyer can be, well, kind of relevant. On Kursk, obviously, this map and this match shows you that it can be useful. It can be very useful, supporting your team and also taking out enemies. But Kursk is not a map which is good, which still isn't good for the SU-76M, because this thing would be great at ambushes, it would be great at plonking it at the end of the street, having the gun looking down it, and as people come around, you just plonk a shot into them. And, well, if you don't knock them out, you should at least do some damage, right? But on Kursk, it's a very open map, and obviously with the SU-76 having hardly any armour, if you get spotted, well, you're gonna take a hell of a hit. And with the fact that this thing is so fragile anyway, with its engine and its gun mantler and its cannon and everything like that, it's very hard. You basically have to play very, very defensive in this thing. So if you see an enemy spotted, you have to know where they are. Sometimes in tanks like the T-34 in Simulator, I'll have a look around, I'll look at my map, I'll see where people are spotted, and instead of going to check who they are, or going, basically waiting until I know exactly where they are, I will take maybe an aggressive or too offensive approach, but I will try and flank them, I will try and see where they are before I properly spot them. In this thing, you can't do that, because, well, if you don't know where they are, and they take a shot at you, you're dead. And that's, unfortunately, the sad reality for a lot of tank destroyers. Now, once again, comparing it to the Stug 3. The Stug 3 has better armour, obviously, than the SU-76. So, it can actually be a tough opponent to take out if you're not in an SU-76. One of the great things about an SU-76 is the fact of that penetration on this gun, even with its APHE shells. It can rip apart basically anything it comes up against. I mean, 67mm of penetration at 1,000 meters. Not even a Panzer IV Aus F2 has that. It has 50mm at most. I mean, you could say maybe the only tank that this thing could maybe not be able to take out around this BR is the Panzer III Aus L, which has 60mm on the front of the turret, including some spaced armour. But then you have APCR. I suppose you could say the same if you come up against the KV-1. Once again, you have APCR, and you can penetrate it below 500 meters. So, the gun on this thing, penetration-wise, is great. Maybe one of the problems is it over-penetrates. I never really thought of that. I have heard accounts recently that people are basically saying that APCR is awful. But if you actually think about it, your APCR rounds are over-penetrating, which basically means that they're going in one end and going out the other, so they're not hitting anything on the way through. And they're not exploding inside the tank, which is what you want. So, maybe that's the case with this thing. Maybe even with your APHE, it's hitting the tank and going straight through, and maybe not doing as much damage as it should. Which further points to the fact that this thing should be used at long ranges, but the maps at this moment do not... Well, they're not long-range maps. Even Kursk isn't a huge map. Once bigger maps are put into this game, the SU-76M will become relevant. The problem is, right now, there aren't any of these. There aren't any city maps, and there aren't any of these big, even 2,000 or 3,000 meter maps, where this thing would be absolutely great. They just don't exist right now. But maybe in the future they will. I hope they do, for the sake of this machine and many other tank destroyers. But anyway, let's get on to the final verdict. So here we find ourselves in the final verdict for the SU-76M, where I'll be talking about the strengths and unfortunately the weaknesses I believe this vehicle has. So onto its strengths. You can penetrate anything you will come up against, even with the standard APHE-BC shell. which is great. I mean, the fact that you can do damage to whatever you see as long as you can get the gun on it means that you can successfully be able to fight off enemies at a good pace. Having so many different ammunition types means that you can be equipped for any situation. Obviously with heat, it's very good at penetrating and doing damage. The AP-HE-BC shell is wonderful, and then you have AP-BC just for that extra bit of penetration, and then APCR for even more penetration. So whatever you come up against, even if you come up against a Panther or a Panzer V, you're able to penetrate them, which is absolutely wonderful. Unfortunately, that's where the strengths run out. Now, if we look at the weaknesses, we shall see some problems. The armour is so thin, it may as well not be there. When you're talking about 20mm of armour, or 10mm, or 15mm of armour, any gun in the game can penetrate that, which also includes aircraft. So basically, you are a walking, ticking time bomb when it comes to people shooting you. People may say, oh, don't get shot. Well, good luck with that. Engine fires seem to happen over and over again. Because there are two engines in this thing, it is very easy to penetrate and hit the engines with high explosive, especially because of the fact that there is no goddamn armour. I wouldn't even be surprised if you could just use a HE shell to set the thing on fire. But I haven't tested that, so maybe I'll find out later. The gun is definitely more RNG than consistency. Even though you can penetrate basically anything you come up against, doing damage is the real thing that you want to be doing. And a lot of the time, I feel like this gun over-penetrates, so the shell goes straight through the tank and not doing basically any damage. But I'm not sure. Once again, there's no way I can test that. So, you know, basically, this gun to me does just not work properly. It should be a wonderful gun, and sometimes it is, but most of the time it isn't. The game mechanics are just not designed for a vehicle like this. In my opinion, in Arcade and Realistic, it is designed around the idea of medium and heavy tank battles. Also, a few light tanks thrown in there, but not many, and tank destroyers and stuff like the SU-76 just do not have a role in that. In simulator battle, they kind of have a role, but once again, would you rather have this or a T-34 or a KV-1? That's what you got to ask yourself on your team. The maps are not big enough to really use this vehicle to its true effectiveness. One of the biggest strengths of this thing is the fact that at 1,000 meters, you can penetrate somebody with 67mm of armor, which is basically anything you can come up against. The problem is, engaging somebody at 1,000 meters never happens. Absolutely never at the moment. The maps are not designed for the SU-76. They need to be bigger. And, well, that also gets onto the maps, which is another problem. But the game mechanics also, as I said, about the mediums and light tanks. The gun depression is absolutely abysmal, meaning that most of the time you will not be able to shoot an enemy. Well, this has been shown throughout the video. The enemies have been able to shoot me, and I haven't been able to shoot them. I have to get into positions where I am vulnerable to shoot them, and even hanging on the sides of cliffs just to use the gun elevation instead of depression, because there isn't any. It's a problem with this vehicle, which means that anything lower than you, well, you just can't hit. And onto the last weakness, which there are many more weaknesses to this thing, but I think this number is enough. The reload time of the gun is one of the longest at its BR. I think one of the early versions of the T-34 has a longer reload time, and that's about it. Basically, everything else that you'll come up against reloads faster. So if you don't get the first shot off, the enemy will have 2 shots to your 1 every time. And against something like a Stug 3, that really sucks. So, overall, what do I think about this thing? I think it's a fun vehicle to drive. It's definitely a challenge. The problem is, this game is not designed for a vehicle like this. The maps are not designed for tank destroyers. They're not designed for stuff like this, and this thing just has too many drawbacks to recommend to play. If you want to play a tank destroyer, play the SU-122 and have an absolute blast. That thing is just fun. And eventually I will do a review on it. But anyway, thank you for watching, and have a great day.